Money in motion is money at risk. Hey, I am Chuck the bureaucrat, and when you get to the Pentagon, there is a whole raft of terms and concepts that people are going to use to intimidate you. In most cases, they use some vague, colloquial notion that it is based in law or policy, but they make it sound like some sort of spooky campfire story. And the example that I find the most egregious are the laws surrounding the Anti-Deficiency Act, what people often call the color of money. What I'm going to talk about today are a set of rules in appropriation law that sets limits on how the federal government can spend money. These laws have to do with the purpose, time, and amount. But before we get started, I have to refresh you on two layers of the federal document hierarchy. These are the top two layers: U.S. Code and public law. They both belong to Congress, and to get to U.S. Code, you go to uscode.house.gov, and public law is at congress.gov. I'll show you where these laws live as we go, but before we do that, I want to remind you that I have this hang-up that professionals should never Google law, policy, or regulation. Google will cheerfully misdirect you, and then you find yourself only able to find a 2014 blog when you should be using the official documents. Okay, the first thing to understand about the Anti-Deficiency Act is that it was first put into law in 1884, so it's been around a while. It was Congress's attempt to nail down what the Constitution meant when it said, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriation made by law." The gist of these laws is that they prohibit the federal government from making a contract that isn't fully funded. But like a lot of long-standing public law, the Anti-Deficiency Act has been codified into U.S. Code. I always think that's funny. People talk about it like it's an act, but it's really part of U.S. Code. Okay, there are three pieces of U.S. Code that are normally associated with the Anti-Deficiency Act: purpose, time, and amount. The purpose clause is in Title 31, Section 1301, and it says, "Appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law." That's pretty straightforward. Congress sets the rules on what tax dollars can be spent on. The time clause, well, that one's a little funny because there's a couple of different places in U.S. Code that talk about appropriations in a time sense. Title 31, Section 1341 makes the point that money can't be obligated before an appropriation is made. Well, that makes sense. And then Section 1301 makes this funny comment about an appropriation being permanent or continuously available only if the appropriation expressly provides that it is available after the fiscal year covered by the law in which it appears. That language has caused some confusion. I mean, go figure. So nowadays, Congress always includes a sentence that is specific about how long an appropriation is available for use every time they enact an appropriation. And I'll show you an example in a second. Okay, so we did purpose and time, and that leaves us with amount. Title 31, Section 1341 says, "The federal government may not make an obligation exceeding an amount available in an appropriation." Now, there is one relevant piece of law that crops up here because without it, people try to sneak around these laws. That is Title 31, Section 1342. And it says, "The government may not accept voluntary services except in emergencies involving the safety of human life or the protection of property." Basically, only Congress can fund government activities. I know. Congress has approved some very questionable exceptions to this rule, but for Pentagon bureaucrats, that is just a distraction. I mean, except for how they expect reserve component soldiers to provide free services. But again, that is out of scope. So let's go back to that colloquial phrase, the color of money. When people use this phrase, what they mean is that all of these limitations essentially create categories of money that can only be spent in specific ways. Yellow money can be spent on yellow things, blue money can be spent on blue things, but you can't spend yellow money to buy blue stuff. But at the same time, it's not like there's some simple color wheel for all these different types of money. Instead, you have to go to the legislation that enacted the appropriation. And to do that, we're going to go to congress.gov. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the whole spiel on how to search this website. You're smart enough to figure that out on your own. But I do have this one tip for you. Unless you're specifically looking for draft legislation, always filter the status of legislation as became law. That's going to make things a lot easier. Now, normally, if you're looking for information about appropriations, you're looking for something that's called the Consolidated Appropriations Act. It's called the Consolidated Appropriations Act because it contains the appropriations for lots of federal agencies. So you have Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of the Interior, Department of State. It's a big document with lots of information. For what we're doing today, I want to show you how to find the purpose, time, and amount information for a specific appropriation. Let's take as an example the Army's missile procurement appropriation. Not only can this appropriation be used to construct, procure, and produce missiles, it can also be used for ground handling equipment, training devices, and machine tools. So the purpose of the missile procurement appropriation, it does include things that are more than just buying the missiles themselves. As far as amount, there's $3.8 billion in change. And for time, notice that this appropriation is available until the end of fiscal year 25. That means it's a 2-year appropriation. All right, so that covers the basics. And now what I want to do is come back and talk about some situations where people might use this idea of the color of money to scare you away, some spooky campfire stories. First of all, Anti-Deficiency Act violations do happen, but they're relatively rare and they tend to happen on a massive scale. So if you're a battalion commander and somebody threatens that you're going to cause an Anti-Deficiency Act violation, I mean, probably not. Certainly not on amount. What you're more likely to run into is like a color of money problem. That is, you've got money in one appropriation, but you want to spend it on something that's really the purpose of another appropriation. If you run into this kind of an obstacle, you're going to have to work with your comptroller to sort it out. And trust me, the comptroller is going to want to make sure that everything stays above board. Now, there are 2 places where your comptroller might play the "ooh, color of money" trick on you. The first has to do with subdivisions within the appropriation. Congress breaks appropriations down into lots of little slices, and then they pay attention to the spending of money within those slices. For example, there's a distinction between the money for initial military training and professional military education. A command can move money between one to the other, and that's not an ADA violation. It's not a purpose clause violation. But your comptroller might be resistant to using initial military training dollars for a professional military education project. And they might be waving the color of money card around. Don't overreact. I mean, they make it sound spookier than it really is. The reason that the comptrollers get resistant is because your higher headquarters, HQDA, DOD, Congress, they can all see that movement of money. And like the old saying goes, money in motion is money at risk. If somebody sees your command reprioritizing money from one account to another, even if it's totally legal, they may decide to cut one account and keep that money for themselves. So the comptrollers have a legitimate concern. It's just not an Anti-Deficiency Act violation. The second situation where comptrollers might make a big deal about the color of money when it really doesn't matter is when it comes to PPBE, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. That's the way that the executive branch drafts its request for funding that the president submits to Congress. Comptrollers and some operators have a lot of experience with the execution phase of PPBE. That is, the execution of appropriated funds, which is what the whole ADA limitation thing is about. When they show up at the Pentagon and start working on the president's budget requests, they're often surprised to find out that we routinely ask Congress to move money between appropriations. I've seen more than one new action officer waving their hands and going, ADA, ADA, sort of as a knee-jerk reaction. Again, it is not a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act to request a realignment of funds between appropriations. Now, it still comes with a risk that you'll be telegraphing a shift in priorities, and money in motion is money at risk. So you might want to be careful about how you do it, but it can be done. In general, you have to understand the rules that govern the work you're doing, and you can't just rely on colloquial concepts to get by. A real good example is the 59-minute rule. It's real, and there are some best practices about how to use it, but when leaders don't understand it, then they often are afraid of it or misuse it. Don't let it be an unknown. Watch this video and learn all about it.